Good afternoon, everyone, and what a lovely afternoon it has turned out to be. Thank you all for being here. Our executive director, Eric Wagoner, could not join us today. It is his young son, Arlo's birthday, so yes, he's got a good excuse. The pleasure falls to me, who is usually tucked in behind the cameras, to introduce today's speaker. She hails from Barboursville, but for today's talk, she came all the way from Wyoming. And like so many moments in history that involve great spans of geography, it all started with a map. Those of you who have known me long enough will want to head for the doors when I mention the South Charleston Naval Ordnance Plant, but don't run yet. That's just where the story starts. I was making my periodic rounds looking through archival collections online for new material related to the plant when I stumbled on something at the American Heritage Center in Wyoming, a map of the 5th Naval District in the papers of a man who'd worked for Standard Oil. But I couldn't tell from the finding aid if the map had what I was seeking. So I emailed the center and received a reply from Dr. Beth Brown, who gently let me down with the news that the map didn't include the district's West Virginia portion. And then she said, "It's so great to hear from someone in Charleston. I'm from Barboursville." So hearing the ringing bell of serendipity, we met at the library when she came back to visit family in November, and the idea to hear about her work as part of the Little Lectures series was hatched. The opportunity to hear about an understudied period of the civil rights movement in West Virginia seemed too good to pass up, especially the chance to contemplate not a purely internal history, but to compare West Virginia's experience to that of other states that formed the borderland between the nominally integrated North and deeply segregated South. To what extent is this period of West Virginia history part of a larger pattern? I'm excited to catch a glimpse of this during the lecture, the Q&A, and talking with you over the refreshments afterward. Dr. Beth Brown is currently the Toppin Rare Book Librarian at the Clara R. Toppin Rare Books Library in the American Heritage Center, University of Wyoming. She received her her BA from Marshall, an MA in History from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, an MSLIS, I got through it, from the University of Kentucky, and a PhD in History from the University of Missouri. Brown's area of focus is 20th century African American history, and her research centers on civil rights activism among college students during the period between 1946 and 1954. Please welcome Dr. Beth Brown.
What Kyle didn't say is nobody else wanted to do his reference letter because the Standard Oil collection is a very big collection, and it's very hard to go through. So everybody was like, "Here, you do this one. You're new." Hopefully, it makes a little more sense why a rare book librarian curator is doing stuff on civil rights. I spend all day looking at books from like the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, and then I go home and read about the 20th century. I get funny looks at work sometimes when I don't get excited about the old books, and I'm more excited about the 20th century books we have in our collection. A lot of this is going to focus on Missouri because that's really the area of my expertise, but I have done stuff on Oklahoma and the border states. It's kind of confusing which states they considered border states, because it's not like the Civil War border states, and it's not like the traditional Mason-Dixon line. It's Delaware, which I didn't do because I forgot about it, Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, and Oklahoma. Now, why Oklahoma's thrown in there, I don't know. It's super significant in the story, but just geography-wise, you just wouldn't necessarily think of Oklahoma as being a part of it, but that is why we're going to go to Oklahoma, too. Oh, my other disclaimer is I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal experience at all. So if I mispronounce a legal term or kind of skip over it really fast because I don't understand it, if any of you are lawyers and you want to tell me what they are later, I would really appreciate it. Separate but equal was not only the law of the land with the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896 with the Supreme Court that pretty much said discrimination was okay as long as it was equal for black and white for the most part at that time. It also extended into most state constitutions in the states that we're talking about. So this is from Missouri's constitution, and you can see right there, it says separate free public schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent. One of the we're mostly going to be talking about desegregation in higher education, so in colleges and universities. Most of the discussion in the 20th century around desegregation would center on that part about children and what really was considered a child, because, they used these laws to say that colleges had to be segregated too, but some people at some points would actually bring the children aspect into the argument, just in case you're wondering about terminology. So Missouri and West Virginia both had segregation written into their state constitutions. And this becomes important later when we're talking about dismantling segregation. Several of the other border states also had specific laws or statutes that required segregation. Kentucky had the Day Law, which was established in 1901, and then Oklahoma had 1908. They had a law put into place that said you had to have separate education. So some of the terms that are going to come up, these law terms I do know, de facto segregation and de jure segregation. And de jure segregation means that there's some kind of law that says that you have to have segregation in place. De facto segregation is something that you saw more in the north and the border states, that it was kind of almost circumstance of place or like local customs or just things that had been around for so long nobody questioned it. That's more de facto segregation. It's just some basic background on the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which is still in existence today. But they were founded in 1909 by both white members of the communities and black members of the community following a deadly race riot that broke out in Springfield, Illinois. So the NAACP was organized to fight against racial prejudice and to work for equality among the races. There were differing things that they focused on through various times, but they usually pushed for litigation. And what I study the differences between if a law or working through court cases is better or more significant than protest and nonviolent direct action where people actually go out and push with their voices for a change. So in the 1930s, their main focus was on anti-lynching laws on the federal level. And that actually has been a focus all the way up to just the past few years, because we didn't have a federal anti-lynching law until just in the last year or two. And then in the 1930s, they also started focusing for change in education. And they really started with equality in teacher salaries. And then in the late 1930s, they saw that the time was right to start pushing for equality in education. So there was continued focus on education until the Brown versus Board of decision in 1954 and its implementation after that, which most people know it didn't happen overnight with 1954 and the Brown decision because of that little phrase it had in there, at all deliberate speed, which was left up to the interpretation of everybody. So the membership of the organization grew really rapidly through the early 20th century. In 1917, they had about 9,000 members. But by 1919, just 2 years later, they had 90,000 members. And they had over 300 local branches in the country. And then by 1946, they had about 600,000 members. So in the time we're looking at, they had almost 500,000 members. These are the two main lawyers who worked with the education suits. Charles Houston, he was brought in under the very first Legal Defense Fund. And then Thurgood Marshall was brought in and was kind of a protege to work with Charles Houston. And then Thurgood Marshall was the one that was on the case of Brown versus Board of Education and was also our first black Supreme Court justice. And most of the time when they would go into local areas, they weren't the ones running the show. They would have local lawyers that they would work with who were NAACP members, and they would have them take on kind of the local things, and they would organize the national part of it. We're going to talk just a little bit about the NAACP method. They had a strategy, and it kept evolving for how they were going to address segregation in colleges, because they knew they couldn't just go in and say, it's not equal, you need to change it. They knew that wasn't going to work. So they had these ways in which they acted to make sure that each case kind of built to the next one, so that they would see what worked, what didn't work, and then they would evolve over time. But one of the things they always did was primarily decided to focus on graduate and professional schools in the South. Does anybody know why? Why you would focus on graduate schools and not undergraduate? See, we'll make this involvement. It's because most of the states would also have what we call now HBCUs, historical black colleges and universities. They would have black schools in the state So they would say, well, we don't need to admit black students to the white schools because they have their own school. West Virginia State College and, Bluefield State. Those were the two in West Virginia of higher education. Missouri had Lincoln University in Jefferson City, and then they had Harris Teachers College in St. Louis. Those are the two I know there. Kentucky had Kentucky State College in Frankfort. And so they would have the schools, and they would say, oh, well, we have the undergraduate programs there. Well, most of the schools in the South did not have graduate and professional schools in the black schools. Most of the states were not going to put the funding into putting in a law school at West Virginia State in the early period. And so that's what they really focused on with these early cases. The person who they chose for plaintiffs was also very important. And that's really what we're going to focus on today. I don't think that the people who were the actual faces of the cases get quite as much attention as maybe they should. It was easier to find who fit the model idea for plaintiffs for graduate and professional schools because they were older. They usually had already done their undergraduate degree. They were a little bit more mature. They had a little bit more of a background that the NAACP could use as basis for saying they really want to go to school, they want to get their education. They also they were very cognizant about someone who had, and this is kind of quotes, good moral character and background. Lawyers for the state schools would use that against people, and we'll see that in several cases. They also wanted to make sure that they had good community support. And looking at this from today's perspective, I think that's probably one of the things we overlook the most in the scholarship is that community support and what the case's effect had on these young people who were the faces of these cases. So they also gravitated, and this is something newer to me, they gravitated to students wanting to apply to law school. And I always kind of wondered why law school. And it's because they thought that the judges that they went before would relate more to law school cases because they were lawyers. So they would know, and it would be easier for Marshall and Houston to show the inequalities that existed between the schools they wanted to set up and the existing law schools already. So Maryland. This is a page from Donald Murray's manuscript, and he is the person who was the face of the Maryland case. So in 1935, he sued to attend the University of Maryland Law School. He was denied because he was black. And then they said, oh, well, since we aren't going to let you come to school here, we're going to pay your tuition to go out of state. And this was very common in the border states that they called them, and I hate this use of this word, they called them scholarships, which makes it seem like, it was a good thing, because when you get scholarships, it's because you earned them. One man at Missouri who talked about it later because he was from Alabama, Alabama tried to give him money to go to a school out of state, and he called it pacifying money, which I think is a little bit more appropriate. So I might start using his term. But they said, we'll pay your tuition to go to Howard Law School in Washington, D.C. And in a lot of these states, the state legislature had money in the state budget to pay for students to go out of state. So these tuition programs were funded by the state legislatures. Although the state paid his tuition, they didn't pay other expenses such as living, books, food, everything else. And they also didn't pay his time. It was located several hours from his home, and he had to drive to it and then drive back to visit his family. So they weren't paying for his time either. So when the case went to court, and this one was only in state court, which is why it doesn't have a larger impact later. The NAACP uses it as kind of precedent, but it didn't have the national significance. The court found that making him move to Washington, D.C. would involve considerable expense, meaning that it would not only cost him money to move and live in D.C., but there was an additional burden on him because he had to be away from his family. So following the decision, Murray attended the school at the University of Maryland, and the NAACP took this success and they decided this is how we're going to go. This worked in Maryland, let's try it somewhere else. So they started looking at the other border states, and they were looking to see where their next focus would be, and so they turned to Missouri. And this one, if I talk too much about Missouri, start waving, because this is one of my bread and butter cases. So Charles Houston contacted Sidney Redmond, who was a prominent black attorney in St. Louis, and they said, do you know anybody that wants to go to the University of Missouri? We think it's the perfect time to see if we can desegregate the University of Missouri. Redmond recommended Lloyd Gaines, who is the man on the far side. He grew up in St. Louis, and he graduated at the head of his class in high school. I think he went to Vashon High School, which was one of two black high schools in St. Louis. In 1935, he graduated with it says he graduated with an AB degree from Lincoln University, but I think it's BA and they just had it switched at the time, back in the day, the abbreviations. And that same year, he applied to the Missouri Law School, and he was denied admission because he was black. There was no law school at Lincoln. And at that time, like we saw in the first slide, the Missouri Constitution designated separate education of races. Since he was denied based on his race, the NAACP decided that this case was the opportunity for their lawsuit. And like Maryland, Missouri had the tuition, the scholarship program, and so they tried to say, here, we're going to give you the money, you go to Kansas or somewhere else that has a law school, and don't bother us. So he went to the NAACP, they filed a lawsuit against the university and their admission policies, and they used the 14th Amendment. The Equal Rights Clause in the 14th Amendment, which is what they used for most of these cases. In 1936, and this is where legal stuff gets confusing, Boone County, which is where University of Missouri is, decided in favor with the university. And they ruled that university had not violated the Constitution because they gave him the option to attend an out-of-state school, or he could wait for them to establish a law school at Lincoln. Those were his two options. And in the court's eyes and in the university's eyes, that they had followed the separate but equal doctrine. So they took it to the Supreme Court in the state. And they also decided the next year, and now, so this is year 2 of this case, they decided to favor with the university. In 1938, he appealed the Missouri Supreme Court decision to the U.S. Supreme Court. During the appeal, the NAACP sought to show that a law school established at Lincoln would not be equal to that of Missouri's. The Supreme Court decided in Gaines's favor. This is the first time the Supreme Court decided on a separate but equal education act during that time period. It's not the first time ever, but during that time period. And they said that Gaines had the right to the opportunity for legal education equal to those made available by Missouri to whites. But the Supreme Court did not say to Missouri, you have to admit Lloyd Gaines to the law school there. They didn't say that. So what they said was, you have to give him the same education. He's entitled to that. So Missouri, the state, opened up a law school with Lincoln in Jefferson City and said, here, this is your school. And then the Supreme Court said, okay, we'll send it back to the state Supreme Court, let them evaluate it after so long and see if it's equal or if we need to revisit it. So Lincoln's law school was located in St. Louis, which is now with the interstates, it's 2 hours away from Jefferson City. But they only had 30 students enrolled in the program, which was a good bit less than the state had estimated and was not using all of the money that the state had poured into it. That, in turn, would make it be a less equal institution than MU. And MU's law school was founded in 1872. So you have 1872 to 1938, you have a school established in 1938. So looking at the equality of those was a big concern. So, this is a postcard. And with most of these cases, we have these postcards or these letters where they would write to, and younger people who are in college now get kicks out of these things because they've never seen anything like it. And when I talk about registering for classes and showing them pictures of how people used to stand in line to register for classes, their just minds bamboozled. Especially that we waited hours and hours and hours to register in line for classes, and now you just do a click on the internet. So he's saying that he's writing to the college registrar to mail you a copy of my transcripts so that I can enter the Missouri U Law School. It was also free back then. And then they would keep that, and they would keep the denial by the university as part of the case's evidence. So people very quickly realized that the law schools were not going to be equal. And I think that, except for on the part of the states who were organizing the law schools, everybody knew they weren't going to be equal. They mostly opened up overnight. Missouri's was a little bit better of a situation than Oklahoma's and Kentucky's was going to be, but they usually had small rooms or spaces that had very little room, and they didn't have libraries. And if you know anything about law school, it's very, very important to have a library for legal studies. So the opening of the Lincoln Law School was met with protests, and this is it's a very dark picture. Protests by members of the Colored Clerk Circle in St. Louis and the St. Louis Youth Forum. But they were also joined by white students from the University of Missouri who went to St. Louis to protest, and St. Louis's Washington University, which was a private school in St. Louis, and Eden Seminary. And they joined with the Civil Liberties Union to protest outside of the Lincoln Law School. Not because they didn't like the idea of law school for the black community members, but because they knew it wasn't equal and it wasn't right, and they thought Lloyd Gaines should go to Missouri. This was a picture in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, and I use this picture because it's not common in a lot of places in the border states that you're going to see pictures of protests until later in the 1960s. They just don't show them because they didn't want to give it a lot of publicity. For my types of studies, this is like gold because we just don't have the illustrations. And you'll see they're holding signs. Those signs say things like, "Old Jim Crow is dead." They say, "Is this equality?" ? And they also say, "Why not all American students at Missouri?" So they really were pointing out at the time themes and arguing that the university and racial discrimination was un-American. And they would sing songs. The article points out to you that they would sing songs, including the Star-Spangled Banner, America, and Battle Hymn of the Republic while they were protesting. So there's a whole nother dissertation just in that. Have any of you heard of Lloyd Gaines? Just a little aside. You have? So you know what's coming next, I bet. And this is the one where I think it's really important that we study the people themselves. So as the NAACP was getting ready to return to court to argue again against the Lincoln Law School being equal, they were unable to locate Lloyd Gaines. And after a year, the NAACP was forced to accept a motion to dismiss the case. His disappearance was later used by Missouri, by the university, when the next person sued them for admission to the university. And this is from Ebony Magazine in 1951. And it's still one of the biggest questions that people in Missouri have today: what happened to Lloyd Gaines? Back on this slide, he wrote this letter. This is just a few pages of a letter to his mother. And he wrote this in March 3rd, 1939. And there's a quote towards the end of it. "As for my publicity relative to the university case, I have found that my race still likes to applaud, shake hands, pat me on the back, and say how great and noble is this idea, how historical and socially important the case, but," and there it ends, "often out of the confines of the publicity columns, I am just a man, not one who has fought and sacrificed to make the case possible, one who is still fighting and sacrificing, almost the supreme sacrifice, to see that it is a complete and lasting success for 13 million Negroes. No, just another man. Sometimes I wish I were just a plain, ordinary man whose name no one recognized." And then he goes on a little bit to talk about he's living in Chicago at the time and he has no job and he has no job prospects and he's just really down on his luck. And he ends with, "Should I forget to write for a time, don't worry about it. I can look at after myself okay. As ever, Lloyd." So Lloyd Gaines totally disappears. Nobody knows what happened to him. There were rumors that he was involved or knew about some going-ons in the gas station where he was working in Chicago, and that he was killed by mobsters. There are rumors that the Klan killed him because of the NAACP case, because he had gotten a lot of attention for it. There were also rumors that he just didn't want to deal with everything anymore and he left. And that's the one that everybody thinks. Supposedly his family didn't even know what happened to him really, or else they were not saying. I was able to meet one of his nieces who came to school at Missouri a few years ago. And it sounds like most people think he went to Mexico to live out the rest of his life. But because of this case, he just didn't. It was a lot. And you can just imagine, and I think that's something we just don't talk about, the mental toll it would have taken on him and his family for this case, because it wasn't decided until 2 years later. And we're going to see with Kentucky, one person went through almost 4 years of dealing with one of these cases. This is an article that made national news in Ebony, and it's one of the biggest mysteries in Missouri and with the University of Missouri that we had on campus. And because of his disappearance, Even though we have the law on the books, it was never implemented. It never happened, so we didn't have desegregation when we could have in 1938. See, the NAACP did use the Gaines case to try to implement the change, and they referred back to it throughout the next decade. For instance, in the McDowell Times, which was a black newspaper here in Keystone, West Virginia, in April 19th, 1940, they have a short wire article that came from, I think in Kentucky, that reported that the NAACP wrote a letter to the president of the University of Kentucky that the, quote, solution of Kentucky's problem of what to do with black college graduates who wanted to apply to graduate programs was to admit these students to state institutions without further ado. And in Kentucky, they did create an advisory committee to look into the issue in the light of the Supreme Court case decision handed down in the Gaines case. So it did create a dialogue, and it did get other states to start to think, you know, we're gonna have to face this, so what can we do about it? Or how are we gonna deal with it? So the Missouri story doesn't end with Gaines. This is Lucille Bluford. She, at the same time Gaines's case was working through the system, she wanted to get her graduate degree in journalism, which people out here don't know, but Missouri is very proud of their journalism school. They call it one of the best two in the country. She had actually earned her undergraduate degree in journalism from Kansas University, which is a huge Missouri rival. And she would have applied to MU, but they didn't have the program, so she took the scholarship and went to Kansas and got them to pay for her scholarship there. So she was already a professional journalist when she applied to Missouri. So she used that to her advantage for her case. She was told to go to Lincoln, but they didn't offer journalism classes. But they said, we will offer journalism classes so you can go to Lincoln. And she was like, She said they wouldn't be a high enough level for her because she already had a journalism degree. And she applied to MU. She got in, went to go register for classes. The registrar saw that she was black. He came out and said, you can't come here. You have to leave. And this happened several times. She applied, got accepted, went to register. They said, no, you have to go home. So she would turn around and go home and then file her lawsuits. So her cases went from 1939 through 1942. And the NAACP did something a little bit different with hers because they sued for damages from the university, saying it actually has a monetary value, what you're doing to her, and saying no, that she can't go to school here. So they did set up school for her in Lincoln. She looked at the professors and she said, I have more experience than them. They can't teach me anything. So she said no. And then it became somewhat of a moot point. She was told by the court that she could go to school at Missouri. But then Missouri decided to cancel their journalism program, the graduate journalism program, and they attributed it to the World War II. And they said, all the professors are fighting in the war. We have nobody to teach the classes, so you can't come here. But in the NAACP and the activists' correspondence from Columbia, they have proof from other students who were in school who were undergraduates that they were offering the graduate degree courses for journalism at an undergraduate level. They went to great extremes to keep students out of Missouri. After her case was done in 1943, they thought the NAACP thought they had it figured out with Missouri. And there was a student named Edith Massey who was going to Lincoln already for the journalism program in undergraduate. Lincoln had decided to close the program because of enrollment. She had 1 semester left. So they thought, okay, surely they'll let her come for just 1 semester. They take it to court. Missouri says, no, we're going to bring professors to her. So they send 3 professors, including the dean of the journalism school, to Jefferson City for every class she had to take. And it's about an hour, probably an hour and a half then, drive back and forth each way to Jefferson City from Columbia. They drove, and the university paid their salaries for Lincoln and their travel for them to go teach her class for that 1 semester. And then down here are some pictures from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch of the last case at Missouri in 1950, which this one was an easy one because, as we'll see in Oklahoma, the result of the court cases in Oklahoma spurred Missouri to take action to get the clause in the Constitution changed in 1948 and 1949 and 1950 because they knew court cases were going to come and they knew they weren't going to be able to win and they weren't going to be able to sidestep it. And the Board of Curators at the time actually decided they were going to choose who sued them for the 1950 case, and they chose 2 students, and then the NAACP chose 1 student, and they sued, and they pretty much just wanted the judge to say, you have to do it. That way they had the justification to do it. So these 3 young men down there in those pictures that you can't really see were the first black students to attend the University of Missouri. And one of them, his name was Gus Ridgel, and I had the chance to meet him a few times. And I wanted to talk to him about his experiences at Missouri, but he found out I was from West Virginia, and his wife was from West Virginia. So all he wanted to do was talk to me about the curvy roads. He died in 2020. I was at least lucky to be able to get to meet him and talk with him. But he might not have wanted to talk about his experience at Missouri because the other 2 students that went in with him at 1950, even though Missouri students, the white students, really fought to get the admission policies changed, they went to the smaller of the 2 schools in Rolla, Missouri, and I don't know if anybody knows Rolla, Missouri. It's very rural, and they were not treated well there, and they wound up coming up to Columbia and then still having problems, so they dropped out. Even when the students were admitted to the white schools, it was not an easy course, as we're going to see with Kentucky. So in 1941, on the front page of the Louisville Courier-Journal, this article ran. It recounted how Charles Lamont Eubanks, the young man in the photo, who was 17 years old, so he kind of went outside the normal NAACP student. He was from Louisville. He had applied to the University of Kentucky for admissions into their civil engineering program. He had already applied to Kentucky State, found out they didn't have engineering, decided to apply to Lexington, the University of Kentucky. They said no because we don't admit black students. So he said he had all of the paperwork. The NAACP then found him, and they were like, here's our next case maybe. They had been looking at some other people, and they were trying to get them to apply to the schools, but he had already done it. And in Kentucky, they had the day law, which had been upheld in 1908 by the Supreme Court, saying that they had to have separate education. And Berea College actually got sued by the state for violating the day law because they didn't want to stop having integrated classes in 1908. And the Supreme Court said, no, you have to, so Berea College got fined, and they had to segregate. So they were hoping to be able to use Berea again because they knew they were amenable to it. But Berea, you had to be from that area, and the Louisville attorneys and the NAACP didn't have the resources to go down there and find a person to sue. So Charles Eubanks had already done most of the work ahead of time for them. He fit their qualifications of having a good academic background. He had been vice president of the student council and the senior class president. He had a stable family situation, and he was interested in doing it. The timing was also right because Kentucky also had the scholarship program, but the state had run out of money. So the state wasn't going to be able to provide the scholarship for any students that were going to have to take advantage of it. So they knew he would be told to use that, but they also knew there was not going to be any money to send him to school outside the state. Prentice Thomas, who was an attorney in Louisville, had him enroll in Kentucky State to take prereq classes to show he was serious about taking the engineering classes. Then the Attorney General worked for UK, and he argued that the suit was not brought up in good faith and that Eubanks didn't really want to attend, and the NAACP was just using him as a patsy. And they only wanted to stir up class feeling, is what they called it. And the Attorney General was quoted in the paper as saying, and this is a quote, "The colored people and the white people have been getting along fine in Kentucky, and we don't like the idea of stirring things up." So that was Kentucky's whole defense, essentially. So Thomas changed, and Thomas worked with Marshall, Thurgood Marshall, on this one. He changed the filing in mid-October to be out of the state court, and he went all the way to the federal court. And he also, like they did with Lucille Bluford, sued for damages. And with those damages, they said they wanted a request for a permanent injunction that forever restrained the university from refusing admission to qualified black students. Interesting thing about this case, and it's something now that I've read a little bit about it, I want to know more. The NAACP had this case funded by American industrialist Godfrey L. Cabot of the Cabot, big Cabot things, he funded this case because he was interested in social justice. So, and that is a whole nother story, because when this case fails, the NAACP is worried about what Cabot's going to think because he spent all this money. Eubanks did not have the support of the black community in Louisville. They did not think the time was right to have a case like this, and they did not want to see this case go. So they did not provide him the support that he really needed during this case. And this case goes to 1943, when they're starting to try to schedule the actual court trial, and there are several delays. In March 1943, Thomas receives a letter from Charles Eubanks' mother that she is afraid he is losing interest in the case because he can't get a hold of him, so he contacted his mother. He works to try to contact Eubanks and reassure him. And in a letter to his mother, Thomas writes, "Some people in Louisville was not in favor of supporting him in this case, and some of the people have done all they can to discourage him. However, I am sure that he has sufficient stamina and patience. All individuals who have accomplished anything worthwhile have had to surmount great opposition," end quote. He does finally get a hold of Charles Eubanks that summer, and and remember, he's only 17 when this starts, so he's very young. He had, in between the filing and the summer of 43, gotten married and divorced, was drafted into the war, because this is World War II time, but got denied because he had an eye defect. He had a lot on his plate. And then they're trying to get a hold of him and say, well, you've got to show up and be in court in Lexington on this date because your trial's finally coming up. And Charles assures him that he is still interested. And he says, "I've come through the dark," in a letter. And he says, "Now that the light has been restored to me once again, and such things as my going into the armed forces has become a thing of the past, I have only one concern, and that is trying to go to school." And at the time, he's even asking Thomas and Marshall to help him get into a law school somewhere else in the country. At that point, he doesn't care if it's UK or not. He's willing to keep going with the case, but at the same time, he just wants to go to school. And he says, the school where the scholarship would be doesn't matter. I just want to go to school. So he had started out in 41, and this is 43. In January 1945, the judge dismisses the case. That's that article up there, because he said there had been no move on the side of the prosecutors, who had kept trying to reschedule things. So his case is dropped. I try to find out what happened to some of the people. Some of the people you know, because there's tons of things written about him. Lloyd Gaines, we know a lot. We don't know what happened to him, but we know about it. Charles Eubanks, I can't find anywhere. I did find his death certificate. He died in March 1964, so he was like 40 years old, and he died of kidney cancer. So I don't know if he continued with school, if he was able to get into law school or what. He's now on my list of people to track down. So they did continue to press for desegregation in Kentucky, and in 49, Lyman Johnson, who was a high school history teacher and civil activist, applied to the PhD program at Kentucky. He was older, he had more life experience, so he was a good NAACP plaintiff. UK wanted to set up, and this also applies for John Hatch, who's the next student. They wanted to set up the equal programs at Kentucky State so that they didn't have to go to UK. And so they set up a history program. He did go to the history program at Frankfurt for, I think, 1 semester, but he had to drive back and forth to Lexington for library resources. And again, like law school, PhD students need library resources, and they don't have the internet at the time. So Johnson said no to this idea and took the case to federal court. And the federal court pretty much said UK has no argument at all. This is not equal. It won't work. You need to admit him to UK. So in the summer of 1949, Johnson and 31 other black students enrolled at UK and attended classes on the Lexington campus. So that's when UK integrated their graduate and professional program. But they faced a lot of discrimination on campus, including separate dining spaces, discrimination in the library, and even death threats. So Johnson finished the summer semester, but he didn't go back. He went ahead and continued, just because I like to tell people what happened, he went ahead and continued teaching in Louisville, taught into the 1960s, and then became an assistant principal. And he was honored an honorary doctorate from UK in the late 1970s. And Gaines and Bluford also got them from Missouri later on. They also have buildings named after him. And he had a middle school named after him in the 1980s. And he wrote an autobiography too at some point, which I'm interested to get and read. And so now John Wesley Hatch is going to school at the same time that Johnson is, and because of Johnson's case. But Hatch was going to the dual law school in Frankfort. He was supposed to take classes on the Kentucky State College campus, but they didn't have a law school library. So what they did was they set him up in a room in the state capitol, which is also what happens in Oklahoma. He had to do that for 2 semesters, but then UK's professors who were traveling to Frankfurt to teach Hatch started to get annoyed with, I assume, the travel back and forth, but they also started saying, well, this dual law school is hurting our accreditation at UK. So 8 of them just up and resigned. So there was nobody left to teach Hatch. So he filed and he went to UK the next semester. He was not allowed to participate in the program's moot court. He had to sit at a separate and single table by himself in the law library. He couldn't find study partners and he couldn't get any part-time jobs. So he stayed for a semester and then he left as well. And he went on to finish his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill and work in public health. So both Hatch and Johnson are very easy to find. And because of time, I'm just going to give you the highlights on Oklahoma, okay? I love that picture of her and her husband. So that's Ada Lois Sepule Fisher. And she was chosen by the NAACP in 1946. They were looking for a case in Oklahoma. And they wanted to do the law school, again, at the University of Oklahoma Law School. Langston College was the black college in Oklahoma. The University of Oklahoma Law School denied her. Oh, the NAACP chose her, but they had been looking at her older brother. And he was a World War II vet, which they liked, thought he would be good at school, but then they found out he was just too antsy. And I don't think he wanted to go to law school. So she was like, well, I'll go. And so she started the process. She applies in January 1946. It goes to the Supreme Court. And in 1948, in January, they reverse Oklahoma's decision, an Oklahoma Supreme Court decision that sided with the university. Hers gets a little different because the Supreme Court made their decision about her a week before classes were to start. They told Oklahoma, you have to admit her, and you can't do anything to delay her education. So they didn't, in theory, have time to set up a separate law school, but they found a way. They put her in a room at the Capitol and had her go to a separate law school. And they said that was good enough. So while she's doing that and going to law school there, she is still suing to say, no, it's not equal, but they had to establish the case that it wasn't equal. So while she's doing that, another group of students, a man named George McLaurin, goes and sues the university. He wants to get his PhD in education. And they did not set up an extra school for him because of timing. So he gets admitted to OU to go into the PhD program. This is what they do with him. They send him in a separate seat in a separate room next to the classroom and say you can't sit next to anybody. And so he sues for mental anguish and says that Oklahoma is hurting his mental state and keeping him from getting the best education he can. And the Supreme Court sides with him. So then that brought down the barriers of discriminating against the students on the campus. What I think is sad for her, he gets into school and goes to Oklahoma and becomes the first black student to enroll at the University of Oklahoma before she does, even though they had said she had to go. So he gets the first title because, the firsts are what everybody studies. She went and got her law degree at Oklahoma because they said you have to admit her. They tried to do this kind of thing to her in the law school, and they set her in seats and put ropes on the seats next to her so nobody could sit next to her. The white students went in, took down the ropes, and sat next to her. They decided they didn't care what the administrator said. So she graduated with her law degree. She went and taught at Langston in their new law school later. And then she was an administrator at Langston, and she wrote an autobiography too. Hers is really good. Last but not least, West Virginia. West Virginia's hard. I found out how hard West Virginia was just this last week. I'm very excited, though, about some work that Dr. Tamara Bailey at West Virginia Wesleyan's doing. She wrote her dissertation on desegregation in the state, and it's embargoed, so I couldn't read it because she's hopefully writing a publication. But they said she's on the board, so I'm hoping something will come out that I will find out about through the grapevine, and maybe I can read it, because it's definitely an area that has not had a lot done with it. A lot of people have done stuff on West Virginia State College, doing not reverse desegregating, but when they had to desegregate all the schools with Brown versus Board of Education, they had to admit white students to the black schools. And West Virginia State was very successful at doing that. So somebody wrote a whole dissertation about them in the 1970s. In 1867 is when the statute in West Virginia said separate but equal schooling. Storer College, which was a Baptist college, and remember, I'm from Barboursville, way down in this side, not up here. It was a Baptist college in Harpers Ferry. It was an integrated school until the state constitution, and then it had to segregate. Skip ahead a whole bunch of years. When Gaines happened, they started to look at Gaines and what they were going to do. With Gaines and Murray, which happened just over the border in Maryland, West Virginia decided they were going to establish a graduate program at West Virginia State College, which would set up, a school that would be equal and offer programs. But the West Virginia State College president suggested instead the legislative appropriations should be used by WVU to improve their graduate programs and change the admission policies at West Virginia to admit black students. Big, mind-blowing idea, because nobody was doing that. 1938, West Virginia University did it. And they became the first border state to admit black students to their graduate school. And in 1940, 3 students were the first to enter grad school, but it wasn't until 1949 that one graduated. Because, a lot of times people just didn't finish. And one of those 3 I found out was Katherine Johnson. So I thought that was fun. She left campus later for family reasons. Marshall University first admitted black students to their graduate and professional school in 1950, and then in 1954 they integrated all levels after the Brown decision. I thought this one was interesting because I tried every newspaper I could get access to online, could not find a single article about WVU integrating in 1938. Couldn't find it anywhere, at least with simple search topics. So I thought this one later from the Raleigh Register, right around Brown, is interesting because it shows the juxtaposition between what happened with a lot of the schools in West Virginia. So the state colleges opened without any big deals, it seems like. And then the high schools and elementary schools around the state were totally different. And it just kind of depended too on the areas you were in. And that's kind of hard to see because there's like hash marks and stuff. But that's what integration looked like in secondary education and primary education in the fall of 1954. So you see some counties did it, some counties didn't. There is a really interesting story, and it's pretty, I have details if anybody's interested. But in late 1954, I think the biggest story I found, at least in the view of the NAACP, was in Greenbrier County with White Sulphur Springs High and the Rupert community. I mean, it's the most detailed report I've ever seen in NAACP papers, so it was pretty interesting reading. It was like 10 pages. The school board said, we're going to integrate the schools. They integrated the schools. There were 2 black high school players who were on the football team who made the football team. Some white players and their parents likely got mad that they made the football team. So they organized the students and parents into a big protest in White Sulphur Springs. And it led to parades of hundreds of people marching down the streets with placards saying they didn't want people in the schools, and they threatened violence against the black students who were in the schools. And so the Board of Education decided, well, we're going to meet, and they decided to reverse their decision to integrate. And they made them segregated again. But the black students were like, no, we're still going to go. So then they had to close down the schools for a little bit until they got things worked out. But the NAACP leaders in Charleston wrote to Walter White, who was the executive secretary on the national level, and they're like, you got to help us. And so he wrote to the governor of West Virginia and said, can you step in and do something? And I don't know what the follow-up is, because that's often what happens with the NAACP records. Sometimes you get all of the information leading up to it, but you don't get the follow-up. And then I read too that Logan, and I think it's Logan, the city, not the county, but they were only going to integrate starting with first graders, and they were going to do a very slow year by year thing. And that wasn't until 1956, I think. So it's very interesting to be able to look at a state and see how it all plays out. Especially when they were really, I really think that WVU stuff's pretty significant. And I'm surprised it's not in more of the books. So that's pretty much it. Sorry, I never have good conclusions. Thank you. I had trouble finding more than a few sentences about the whole WVU integration. I know there's more, I just wasn't able to find it online. Because I know it has to be in their board of curators or board of whatever, the board of directors, the trustees meeting records. Those are so good for this kind of work because that's where the real conversation about integration usually happened. So I was only able to do what I could find on West Virginia WVU's like main page and their library page. They had a little blurb. My primary research I do is I look at World War II veterans who are coming back and go to school on the GI Bill. And a lot of them were going to schools that were segregated or in segregated areas. And I look at the white veterans especially, and they were going back and they were fighting for civil rights for the black students that were with them or the black community that they were, that were in the town where they were at. So I really look at a lot of the veterans. So then that leads to have to look at football, even though I know nothing about football and basketball. But a lot of it played out, and a lot of integration, especially in the Midwest, played out in the sports, in athletics, because they had the gentleman's agreement. So Iowa State was part of the Big Six, which was Iowa State, Kansas, Kansas State, Missouri, Oklahoma, because it wasn't Oklahoma State yet, and what was the sixth one? Nebraska. And Colorado came later. And they were having a big discussion among the students in those schools, especially Kansas and Nebraska, about leaving. They wanted their people to leave the conference because of how Oklahoma and Missouri would not let black players come and play on their fields. And because they wouldn't let them play, they couldn't play in the whole conference. It was a whole big to-do. And Oklahoma, big football team, still big football team. They had all the money, so they were really controlling the whole conference. But a lot of the students came out and said, we're going to protest this. And that's where a lot of the change did come. And Iowa State, I think it's Iowa, though. But they were I looked at Iowa State more than anything else. But like I said, I only know about it with athletics. But if you Google Johnny Bright, not a good story. He was a football player, I think, for Iowa, and they played Oklahoma A&M, which is Oklahoma State, and they almost killed him on the football field because he was African American. That was, I think, in the late 30s, but I'm not positive. But that's the name that I know from Iowa. So yeah, that's all I know about Iowa. So I did my undergrad at Marshall, and I had started out straight from high school in pharmacy school for 2 years and decided I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do history because I liked the yearbooks I looked at pharmacy school better than the pharmacy stuff. And so I decided to become a historian. And the summer before my last semester at school, I was in Memphis taking a German class to transfer back to Marshall to get my German credit. And my aunt and I went to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. If you haven't been there, it's really worth it. And there was a picture, because, like I said, I didn't hear about Katherine Johnson. We didn't learn Black history at all in school, except for maybe Martin Luther King Jr. And we were at the Civil Rights Museum, and I was looking at all the pictures, and this is also what made me want to go into museums and archives and stuff, too. And there was a picture on the wall in the exhibit of people protesting outside White Cafe in Huntington in the 60s. And it was right across the street from where I worked through my junior and senior high school at Bailey's Cafeteria. And I had no clue. And it was just, they always say museum stuff, you make that personal connection. You want people to make that personal connection with the artifacts. and it creates like a big aha moment. And that was my moment. And I was like, how did we not learn about this? And so I started doing at Missouri, when I was working at Missouri, I started looking at civil rights there and started finding out that the dates on our pictures of some sit-ins were 1958. And I'd been reading all these books and classes saying everything started in February 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I was like, wait a minute, that's 2 years before that. And then found out there's this whole movement before that, just doesn't get as much attention. And then I found out that, people were doing it right after World War II. So, but it was all that picture of the Civil Rights Museum.
Thank you for your presentation. I grew up in Oklahoma.
You did? I did too. I grew up in Oklahoma before West Virginia.
And I went to Lincoln University of Missouri.
Really?
And I taught at the University of Missouri.
You did? What's your name?
Ledbetter.
Charles
Ledbetter. I was there from 72 to 75.
Okay, what did you teach?
I was in the ROTC program.
Okay.
I was in the military.
Did you know they're getting ready to tear down the ROTC building?
No, I did not.
They are.
I did not.
Yeah. My partner is the university archivist there, so I still find out all the good stuff. But yeah, they're going to tear down that building, Crowder.
But I grew up in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
In Oklahoma, and I went to start at college in the 50s, late 50s. And so everything that you were talking about, I'm familiar with and remember all of those kinds of things. And I've even shared on occasion that when they talk about all deliberate speed, my high school in Oklahoma didn't integrate until 1970.
Yeah.
They didn't integrate the schools until 1970 in Muskogee, Oklahoma.
Okay, Muskogee. Okay. I grew up in Guthrie.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and even in the 2000s, they were still having desegregation cases related to Brown, related to busing and things. So we still, that's still a big issue. But yeah, the all deliberate speed thing. And Virginia was really bad with all deliberate speed. They actually would shut down schools, the whole school districts, just period, because they didn't want to integrate.
You mentioned about the paying for black teachers to go out of state to get their degrees, and other black people in Oklahoma, for example, go out of state to get their degrees. When the 54 decision was made, the local paper in Muskogee had an article about how the teachers in black high school wouldn't be qualified to teach the white kids in the integrated school system.
Yeah.
So they did a survey, and they discovered that the black teachers were much better educated than the white teachers, because they had in fact taken advantage of that scholarship out of state and gotten degrees from Harvard and Yale and Princeton and all these other places. And the percentage was like 60-some-odd% of the, now this is in the 54.
Yeah.
The percentage of black teachers in my high school who had graduate degrees was like 60-some-odd%. And it was like 10 or 15% in the white high school.
Yeah, and that came up in West Virginia too. I didn't do too much because I don't do too much with the younger schools, but that was a big deal in West Virginia too, because they kept saying, because there was always that thing about, and you still see the debate now about, well, did the black schools really want their children to go to the white schools? And, because they had the community and they had, there were certain advantages to having the separate school for them community-wise, but not equal-wise. But that was one of the things, because they weren't going to let the black teachers teach at the white schools because they didn't think they were good enough. And yeah, most of the time, I'd seen some studies in Columbia and Missouri of Douglas teachers and other teachers, and they were all much more educated most of the time.
Mentioned that, that's about when I started college at Lincoln University, Missouri. And the hotels and motels were segregated.
Uh-huh.
And I worked at a restaurant, at a hotel restaurant in Jefferson City. And I washed dishes. And I washed dishes during the day, and then when my time was up, I'd go outside and join the demonstrations to integrate.
Yeah, and there were this stuff, my dissertation's all on students who did protest at Missouri, and then I compared it with Kansas, and being from Mizzou, the two do not get along at all at the University of Kansas, and found that the University of Missouri, the white students did way more to make things, to integrate the school and to make things better than the students at Kansas did. And the students at Kansas, they're very proud of their Free State reputation, but in the 1920s, they really started discriminating against the black students on campus at Kansas. So students started fighting back in that 1940s period, but they were much more successful in Columbia and much more doing more things. And there was a group who would go and meet with students at Lincoln, and they would exchange. They were called the Current Events Group. They were one of the little committees from the YMCA and YWCA on campus. And so they would just get together and just talk about what was going on in the world, and that was creating a dialogue between the black and the white students, and getting the ideas going. And that's something I really look at, as how those ideas flowed. And that it's bigger than, people don't pay attention to it because they say it didn't have any national significance, but a lot of those people went on to other places in their careers, and they influenced civil rights leaders later.